Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Gremlins 2, the new batch. So, pretty much after this thing had started and then had finished, immediately the first thing that popped into my mind is like, oh no, I actually have to review this film. This film is a massive undertaking. There's so much involved in this movie, possibly compared to the first one. How at some points in time we have this movie that kind of goes through the catalog of Warner Brothers, kind of like a Space Jam New Legacy before Space Jam New Legacy was even a thought or a thing. How we kind of have one gremlin who is to kind of slap his Warner Brothers logo upon his chest as he was to get tattooed by some tattoo parlor gremlin. Because basically anything that you could possibly come up with eventually has gremlin attached to it. Like if you go through any of the things of any of the kind of the differences of characters, like kind of going back and just be like, holy crap, there's like a Phantom of the Opera gremlin, there's like there's a bat gremlin, it goes on and freaking on. But also we have to like get to the buildup of the gremlins that look more like Gizmo, and then eventually go into their little cocoon like states, and then eventually change to eventually who they eventually become. So much of this movie does kind of like, especially when it's kind of crazy how much more massive like the gremlins are to be in this film compared to the first. Whereas really like so much of the way that these gremlins are to look in this movie very much remind me of a movie called The Guyver, of course, with like Mark Hamill. Like the monsterish like characters that are to be presented in that film. I'm like I couldn't help but going through this Gremlin movie of like this, like all these characters look like the Guyver monsters. No offense to anybody who was to put this together, but that's what it just like when I was looking at these characters, I'm like, this looks like the first movie, The Guyver, for whatever reason. I'm like, all right. So, like, it seems like we end up having a lot of fun with this movie. We go in and just really kind of put a lot of stuff out there. We even have at some point where the movie is even critiquing its previous film, and we have a movie reviewer who's like, well, hey, I'm going to review Gremlins. I don't know why. And so we end up having them even like breaking the fourth wall, and we weirdly have Hulk Hogan come into this movie for whatever reason. No offense, Hulk Hogan. I am just so confused why we have a spot where Hulk Hogan is in this movie. Again, no offense to that man. It's just, it seems random. And all of a sudden, like, Hulk Hogan is like busting like a promo on the Gremlins to eventually get this whole movie back and started and whatever. I'm like, this movie is just so weird. That's because I didn't remember it at all. Because like I probably never really clearly watched this film because of how scared I was for whatever reason. But yeah, like I remember like this was like a story that eventually I said on the other Gremlins movie, but like I remember just seeing a commercial of Gremlins at one point in time and just screaming my head off just because I was like so afraid for Gremlins for whatever reason. But now looking back on it and just like why did I have such a problem with this? I don't know. It must have been just some weird goofy-ish thing where it's like you end up having like much more of a fear of like smaller monsterish things than you would some big massive large monsterish thing. But anyways, so now that I've kind of gone in and kind of talked about this movie, we end up having characters like Daniel Clamp that is to basically give us a huge, massive building that has any number of things that are to be developed and put into it. TV kind of stational things, very much a barrage of certain kind of like. Here's the confusion of this. Like, it kind of turns into this like almost like shopping malls slash uh like TV stational thing. Like, there is kind of this mad confusion of what this building actually is, and it seems like there is like a endless thing of just all kinds of things within this building. We also have Billy's character, who is to be uh, showcasing even much more so than I think maybe in the first movie, that he is to eventually be some artist or supposedly a guy who's to kind of draw up something to eventually show to his boss. And so uh, we end up eventually bringing Gizmo in the sequel, kind of like weird, much more weirdly than we did the first, where it seems like the first was like okay, like I think the first one did have a better idea of how to get Gizmo back or get Gizmo to Billy. Where I think in the second one, it just kind of feels that there's to be this much more like kind of laziness with it. It's just like, oh yeah, like Mr. Wing or yeah, Mr. Wing was to pass away, and the building ended up getting demolished, and so now Gizmo has to find somewhere new to live. Huh? But we do have these interesting performances randomly kind of being placed in this film. Uh, so eventually we have this kind of wide barrage of fun that is to happen here, and I'm going to try my best to eventually try and break this down the best way I can, because I feel like I'm going to be all over the place with this review. So with this said, the Gremlins, instead of going off to attack a small town this time around, they are to go ahead and seemingly go after this one skyscraper-esh like building, which they are attached to, because really that's where the eventual gremlin situation is to pop off. Again, probably one last goofy scenario is like how eventually Gizmo eventually does get this thing called wet in this movie, but like we have to kind of settle with a lot of goofy things in this movie, goofy approaches, and again, this movie is to just be like, hey, whoever put together this film had a lot of fun doing it. I'm sure a lot of the characters that that were really just presented in this film, like I was like surprised. There was like one moment where I was like turning. I was like, oh my god, Long Duck Dong is in this film. um, uh, there's to be a guy named I think his name is Jed Wannabe. I'm check it out on IMDb. The guy who end up guy no I sadly know him only as Wong Duck Dong from 16 Candles. But like I was like, oh my god, he's in this film as this like cameraman ish like guy that is to kind of go through and kind of have this kind of like this kind of film kind of thing, and he's like, I am the camera. And I was just like, man, like there is some like weird call outs in this film and some weird characters in this film. Um, like we have like the twins from Terminator 2 in this film, uh, Martin and Lewis, that eventually are to be mixed up in this film. Um, but yeah, so like a really fun film. Glad that I had finally just rewatched this, because like I felt like it was a tradition that like now what the heck am I going to do next Halloween? More than likely next Halloween might just be movies that probably scared me the most. Like I remember watching like Drag Me to Hell, and that was a really just like, man, this movie's getting me actually scared for once. Um, like out of respect for a Sam Raimi film. Um, so yeah, I might just eventually have to come up with some kind of compilation, some kind of thing to eventually just go like, okay, well, next year, I'm gonna eventually have to just kind of put out something that actually just got to me or scared me or whatever. I'll just have to come up with a random a batch of something, because now the tradition after this movie is now over, unless they come up with some Gremlins animated thing, which I would just watch that probably whenever instead of waiting until October and then bust it out, just because you'd have to get that done as quickly as possible because that's the way that YouTube is. So, with that said, let's just go into that double five time territory. Let's just go into spoilers because I'm going to have to figure out a way to go and talk about this movie and try to get this all perfectly in line because good grief do they do so many things in this movie. Eventually they just stop the movie and they're like, meh, like I'm not gonna give you the film. Like we're gonna just stop right here, and then all of a sudden Hulk Hogan is like, hey, you better stop. Then they restart the movie. I'm like, huh? What? So if anything, for a good while, I might be dancing around certain kind of names of certain kind of characters, because I might not know them clearly, because I'm better with faces than names. And plus, also, there's too many things going on here in this film out of respect for the thing. I want to try to get some of these or somewhere ballparkingly correct. So, with that said, we also don't have a stripe in this film. Like, we don't have a stripe gremlin in this film. We end up just having Mohawk in this film. And I'm like, okay, so I guess they had to, like, when really considering it, I guess they're like, well, we couldn't just have another stripe in this film because, like, we had to come up with some kind of other thing because that stripe was taken out via the first film. So, yeah, let's go on with it. Let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So, very beginning of the film, we are to seemingly have Mr. Wing that is to get a videotape sent to him of Daniel Clamp demanding for his property. We end up having like these guys, who I believe is Forrester and his kind of goons, kind of making his way with this TV, and so we get a kind of weird, interesting visual when we open up this movie. I'm like there was some parts of me where I kept kind of like double checking. I'm like, this is Gremlins 2, right? I don't remember this movie well at all, if I even remembered any of it. Like, but like Gremlins was like the same way. Like I remembered nothing about that movie. If I did, then more than likely you would have had to have heard me say something about it where I remembered something. Complete blank slate here. So, because my life becomes a blur at some point. So, Daniel Clamp is to eventually show up upon this TV screen talking to Mr. Wing in a uninteractive manner, because this is like a certain time period where this is just a tape recording, where Daniel Clamp is to mention that he wants Mr. Wing's property to eventually go and turn his building uh, into some kind of oriental themed thing. And so, and eventually, I guess Mr. Wing is the last part of this, where Mr. Wing is just like, no, I'm not going to give this to you. Like, you guys can come in here and ask every day. You can bring me all the TVs you want, but yeah, no. And this is still, of course, the time period of tube TVs where, like, man, like, imagine just hauling that TV in there and that VCR and so on and so forth. So, Forrester is to tell Mr. Wing to keep the TV, and so all of a sudden, Gizmo was to kind of go and take the remote and just kind of adjust it to eventually watch some certain TV. And I think Gizmo was a big fan of Rambo, because I guess Sylvester Stallone is to technically be in this film. I guess as like archive footage or something like that. But hey, Sylvester Stallone is technically in a Gremlins movie for whatever reason. Because I saw that on IMDb and I'm like, oh, Stallone is on a is on a Gremlins movie. Or a Mogwai. Could you have just imagined them calling this Mogwai and like eventually trying to get away with it? Like, hey, could anybody even pronounce Mogwai? I could, but I don't even know if I'm even saying that word right. So eventually, since they were to go and do and offer Mr. Wing as much money as humanly possible, Mr. Wing rejected this. So they're like, well, if anything, Forrester is to realize that Mr. Wing is seemingly starting to get to poor health because he coughed once. So that must mean poor health. So Forrester is like, we can wait. We can wait. We can get him. Well, yeah. So I guess Mr. Wing was to go and die off because this guy is like 1,000,000 years old. And why is it that he just dies off now? Like, you would have thought this guy would have had some magical herbs or something like that to live forever. But I guess not, sadly enough. R.I.P., Mr. Wing. R.I.P. So they go on and they start to demolish this building. And so all of a sudden Gizmo is like, hey, I gotta get out of here. I gotta scramble out of here, you know? So all of a sudden we see Gizmo just kind of running out of the building as it's getting demolished. And so all of a sudden, Gizmo is to get picked up, voiced by Howie Mandel, of course, the very talented Howie Mandel. No, like, even, like, we also have this voice kind of used for Bobby's World, but hey, freaking, like, if a guy could use one voice and use it 50 different ways, then that man is a genius. That guy is smarter than everybody else. If that guy can use one voice and freaking get that and be able to use that everywhere, then give him freaking credit, because like this guy had worked his butt off to have been able to get opportunities to use this kind of voice for X amount of projects. Like, look at probably any number of any of those characters that eventually, like, look at Slimer. I'm sure the person that voiced Slimer has probably used that same Slimer voice, like, in 10 different other things. Where it's just like, yeah, I just used the Slimer voice and they just love it. And I just, like, I kept getting work and and no one complained. No one complained that it was basically the Slimer voice. So, So eventually we have one of the twins, either Martin or Lewis, who are to eventually go and find Gizmo in the streets of Calcutta. It's probably not Calcutta. I always like to say Calcutta. It's always the random location of which that I don't know where that actually is. If that's actually a real place, whichever. But I always like to say Calcutta for every location that I don't know the exact location, because it's fun. So one of the twin characters are to bring back this Gizmo to this slice of life place where supposedly they're to deal with gene slicing or potion concocting or just any weird number of things. And so we, of course, have Christopher Lee, who, of course, a lot of people know him from Dracula or Lord of the Rings characters or any number of things that eventually I will probably have forgotten by now. He was also on some werewolf film, I think, called The Howling at some point. Anyways, Christopher Lee, who ended up playing Doctor Catheter. I want to say catheter. That sounds awful. I'm gonna butcher the name. It's bound to happen. So this doctor is to eventually have these two twins eventually uh, telling him about this thing that they had found in the middle of the streets somewhere. And so, weirdly enough, these two twins, like, I guess, have been able to play around with this Gizmo-esque like character for quite a while. To all of a sudden, we are to play a song and see this Gizmo go and like just dance it out. And I'm like, wait a minute. Like this feels like Ghostbusters 2 with like the whole toaster thing where they end up putting the slime in the toaster and then the toaster starts dancing to Jackie Williams. And then eventually like Bill Murray is just like, oh, it's a unique gift item, you. And then Dan Aykroyd grabs him and hauls him out. Um, so, uh, and then I think because they end up doing the toaster eats the hand bit. So Gizmo is dancing it out, and I'm just like, okay, so is that the one weakness that they haven't realized of Gremlins, that maybe if there is to be music present, they have to dance? So what if there's something we've been missing all along, that if a gremlin all of a sudden absurdly just starts to attack you, and really in this movie we get some real like surprise jumping out actions, which could probably scare people in this movie. Uh, and so, uh, like, I was just kind of caught off guard because I'm like, man, this is kind of random. I wasn't exactly like scared for whatever reason, but I was just kind of caught off guard. Like that isn't scared, but like you can define it whatever you want. Oh yeah, I just couldn't stop jumping throughout this whole entire film. I was like, well, my God, whoa, Hulk Hogan, oh, he's a scary dude. Don't you even like? Don't you even not be scared by Hulk Hogan? Even John Glover, sometimes in the right light, you can just kind of don't let that man fool you. He has killed Uma Thurman in his past. He has been on Fear the Walking Dead. Don't go easy on him. I'm having fun. So, pushing on. So, uh, so we end up having it to where eventually there is to be a messenger going on to this slice of life, and we have the woman who is to be there, who is to just kind of blow her nose, and the doctor is to collect it. Peggy, who's to be this slice of life secretary, is to just kind of sneeze onto some tissue, and we have Christopher Lee's character who's like, "Oh well, I wanted the flu sometime today. Like I wish that they could have shipped me the flu. Now I'm getting this. Oh." And so the girl like sneezes on this tissue, and he's like, "Oh, I'd love to just have this tissue. Could I save it for a sample?" It's like he sounds like freaking Harold Ramis from Ghostbusters, where it's like spores, molds, and fungus. I collect spores, molds, and fungus. That's my fun. So Christopher Lee goes on, sees that this gizmo is dancing, And so he ends up grabbing it before Gizmo is to try to run off. And so Gizmo is to be put back in his cage. And so now Gizmo is to have this kind of humming, whispering song. I don't think so. I don't think you can. Well, there is a whisper song. Could you imagine Gizmo doing the whisper song? Wait till you see my. Ah, we went there. We went there barely, but we did. So, wait till you see my gremlin. Pushing on. I'm having fun. Gizmo is to, of course, be whistling Sweet Dixie. And so this messenger is to hear this whistling of Sweet Dixie and is to go and be kind of repeating the song while he's going to randomly send messages to everybody in the building. So all of a sudden we have Billy, who's to be working at this building, going in with his soon-to-be possible wife, Kate, who of course was in the first one and now is in this one. Billy and Kate are to seemingly be living together. It seems like this relationship is going well until Kate is to eventually go and no longer be seemingly doing films anymore, and then eventually goes and aligns herself with Chris Klein at some point. And the story ends. So Kate is to eventually go with Billy because she is to also, I guess, be the tour guide of this building, which I'm like, man, there is some kind of goofy kind of clothing that these people are to wear, but it's kind of the telling of the time where you end up having these people with these kind of, like, it's goofy kind of clothing, but it's also, like, weirdly also interesting, so it's goofy but interesting, you know what I'm saying? We rarely have these girls that end up having these hats that has this like skyscraper like thing coming out of it, and I'm just like, why? I guess because you could probably see them coming from any portion of whatever, and if you're to get lost, you could probably just be like, oh, there's my tour guide, obviously. So, so Kate is to be this tour guide where eventually she's gonna kind of show people around eventually. In some parts of this movie, and then eventually she gets to a part where eventually there starts to be gremlins that are going and spotting certain kind of things in certain parts of shows. But we'll get to that. So all of a sudden, so Billy is to go to his work and he's hard at work, and all of a sudden we have Forrester who ends up coming in and is to rag on Billy with Marla present. And so Forrester's come in and like, hey, you have a plant here. Ha! Like, how dare you have a plant? And then all of a sudden, also, Billy is to have a, like, photo replica of his hometown to kind of just give us a memory of the first film. And so we end up having Forrester who's like, well, here's the thing about this artwork, Billy. Like, this seems to have a very personal touch. Like, I get it's something to kind of help you like keep the work going, but Forrester is also to showcase Billy that there is to be this art that is to also be presented upon this wall, that is to be approved art for them to have here. So it seems that Billy did not get approval of his hometown picture upon his cubicle, so I guess everything has to be run by this company before Billy could run seemingly anything upon his cubicle. So after that kind of ridiculed moment, it seems that eventually Billy and Marla, like Marla is to be interested in eventually going to eventually have dinner with Billy, and Billy accepts this, and so eventually it seems that Billy was to say that this is a professional get-together, But later on, it seems that Marla is to seem to be much more unprofessional than Billy is. So Billy is to all of a sudden see the messenger walking by, whistling that sweet Dixie song of Gizmo. And so Billy is to ask this messenger, "Hey, where exactly did you hear that song from?" Because it's familiar to him. And so the guy is like, "Well, that slice of life place." And so Billy is to run down there. And so Billy is to mention to Peggy that like there's something up with her copier, and that he's gonna go and try to fix it. And like once Billy kind of goes into this laboratory, why is it that absolutely seemingly no one stops him? Billy starts to peek his head through certain kind of cases to eventually see kind of absurd or odd looking animals at some point. See some kind of potion concoctions, as if anybody is Severus Snape that is going to come in here and like turn the page to 464. And so Billy is to go on and is to eventually go and finally seemingly figure out where Gizmo is to uncage him, and then is to go and put him in some toolbox, which I'm like, I'm sorry, like Gizmo, like wouldn't he be like suffocated in this toolbox? So because I'm very worried about Howie Mandel's future career with Gizmo and and other Gremlin stuff. If you were to have killed Gizmo right then and there by suffocation in toolbox, how could you have set up a franchise for this film if there was ever to be one? Because there might very well be eventually somewhere down the line. Like you couldn't have had a Space Jam New Legacy with Gremlins in it because this would have been a much shorter film. Pushing on. Why did I take so long to talk about that? Billy goes into this bathroom and is to unhinge the seemingly toolbox. We have bizarrely this bathroom that is talking to people, that is accusing people of not washing their hands or any number of things. Because we also have an elevator that also talks to people, and eventually Kate is to go into this elevator, not realizing that it's clustered with gremlins upon it, but we'll get to that later. So Billy goes, opens his toolbox, and like, "Hey, Gizmo!" Like, "Hey, buddy!" It's been a while. Weirdly, Gizmo is to have a wristband because he likes to be trending. He really wants to eventually have like a whole clothing line, but like we're just too far ahead of ourselves. Because eventually it gets cold in whatever location that the gremlins are to be in, and so like weirdly we just have like Gizmo weirdly with like this wristband. Then eventually he has like a bandana into part of this movie. What is up with like really like Gizmo should have just really just popped out like a whole like yeah like Gizmo is gonna be wearing some jeans and like a hat tilted to the side. He has like a big fat chain that says Giz on it. Could have worked. Could have worked. So, or it could have been Mo on it, or it could have been Gizmo or Ghetto, or I don't know. Anyways, pushing on. So, Billy is to eventually go and take Gizmo and put him by his cubicle and put him uh, in his kind of filing cabinet, and he like tells him it's like, "Hey, like I'm gonna go and like I'm gonna get to you and I'm gonna like pick you up after work is over. Like so, just hold out in here and I'll get back to you." And so all of a sudden, Billy is to eventually go and see that Daniel Clamp is to be here, and like we end up in like the early stages of this movie where we have that huge Clamp statue that ends up just having like the names and stuff on it. And like that is such a weird logo, but like again, I could like I guess they couldn't figure out exactly like what to do with like a name like Clamp. Like I want to kind of like I'm kind of curious if there was like any like rough draft stuff that they were thinking about doing before they settled on the whole like clamping of the globe thing. Like maybe they were coming up with other kind of ideas of what to do for that visual, or maybe they're just like, no, this is easy enough. So Daniel eventually is the spot that Billy is to have drawn um, this kind of very interesting artistic like thing. And so Daniel's like, oh my god, like this building here, like I definitely want to do something with this. And so all of a sudden, Gizmo is just kind of pop this file cabinet open a little bit. And so Daniel's like, well, hey, what's up with this filing cabinet? To where like Billy is like, oh yeah, it's a filing cabinet where it seems that anytime like you get near it, it just like opens itself. Uh, like I really just think that Gizmo needed a little bit of air because like he didn't get enough of air with that whole toolbox situation. Again, securing Howie Mandel's career. Gizmo needs to be saved. Save the Gizmo. I'm having fun. So Daniel is to eventually go on and leave and just kind of move on to the next worker. And so that's when eventually Billy and Marla are just kind of going off onto this date, supposedly. Well, Billy doesn't realize that. So Billy is to eventually go and talk to Kate. And I'm like, wait a minute. Like, Kate is to be in this female locker room, and Billy's just nonchalantly just walking in there. Is that appropriate? Like, what? Like, you would have thought, like somebody would have been in, like, wait a minute, like, Billy's in this locker room? Maybe it's a unisex locker room. I don't know. But still, questions are to be had. So, Billy is to tell Kate, hey, would you mind if you could go and, because Gizmo is back in town, so would you mind if you go and you collect Gizmo? Because you have had so much illustrious history with this character that you know exactly what he looks like and you know exactly what to do with this character. And so Kate is like, well, like, don't you have rules for this thing? And then she ends up kind of busting out the rules. And so Billy is to mention about the whole light thing and especially about sunlight. I'm like, but wait a minute. Wasn't Gizmo this thing called Outside at some point where he eventually gets collected by this man and taken to this slice of life place during the day? So how is it that Gizmo is not dead at this point? Again, Gizmo needs to be saved. Did the guy put like some kind of trench coat or something over this thing? I am not the sure. But again, Gizmo could have died numerous times in this movie, and I blame the creators of this film. Gizmo could have died numerous times. They should have had at the very bottom of here, no innocent gremlins were harmed in the making of this film. The only innocent one was Gizmo, just so you know. Because all the rest of them were evil and they were killing people. Well, like some of them were trying to have fun, but like a lot of them were going and just tearing through people, trying to bite into people, and so on and so forth, which I can't condone. Even though they might have been hungry. Still, they could have, like, there's a number of huge, convenient places to eventually eat something in this whole entire building. The gremlins and the humans could have easily lived in equality or whichever, but no, the gremlins are like, you know what, I just gotta chomp a man for whatever reason. I just gotta bite into a person. Which I'm like, dude, go to that yogurt place. They have like a billion things for you to eat. But no, the yogurt place just was not enough, now was it? So, I'm going on too many tangents. So, and we haven't even freaking got to anywhere. So Kate is to go and hear the rules, sunlight, Don't feed him after midnight. And what the heck is even the third one? Don't get it wet. And so Kate is to eventually go and find Gizmo. And here's the problem. So Gizmo ends up getting out of the file cabinet, so technically this is his own fault. And hey, he's almost dead numerous times, so now this is on him. Gizmo gets out of the filing cabinet to all of a sudden have this janitor weirdly at the same time going and adjusting this water fountain, which I'm like, oh no, stuff's getting real. So this janitor evidently is to not have been able to figure out how to control this water fountain power that is to have this huge arc, and I mean huge watery arc that doesn't even rationally make sense to me. But like this thing is like freaking like this fountain has some power to it. Like it could go and like you could play a game out of it where like somebody's just sitting in their cubicle, like, hey man, water, yeah. That's how interesting this is. So evidently this janitor is trying to fix this, but yeah, it's freaking broken. And so he just ends up walking off. But the water ends up kind of arcing so far to go onto Billy's office place where he sketches things to eventually drip upon Gizmo, which all of a sudden has Gizmo go and create gremlin balls, which I'm like, is no one else around this area during any point in time of this stuff popping off, so to speak? So eventually, to save time, we have a number of gremlins that are to come from out of Gizmo. Mohawk is to show up into the trash. I think George is to eventually be one of the kind of the black haired gremlins, the black and white colored gremlins. We end up having Lenny, who's to be the kind of goofball looking one, where it's like, huh, where he has a kind of huh kind of face. And we end up having Daffy, who is to be the one that Kate is to eventually go and collect. Daffy, of course, has the name Daffy just because he really just sounds like a Looney Tune-ish character. Also, he kind of has visuals like a Looney Tune-ish like character, and so on and so forth. So, really, I think that is to perfectly, I think, represent most of the ones that ended up coming from out of Gizmo. So, eventually, these gremlins are all to go and kind of surround Gizmo and eventually put him into this ventilation shaft, where then Gizmo is going to have to Bruce Willis it up to eventually figure out how the heck to eventually get out of this ventilation shaft. So now we end up having, of course, these gremlins eventually wreaking havoc. But then eventually the main thing to kind of really give about is eventually these gremlins are underneath this one chair by this yogurt shop. And then, so all of a sudden, we eventually have these people who are kind of going and doing their yogurt shop work to all of a sudden have these gremlins seemingly popping out of this these yogurt foods. And I'm like, you know what I thought? Like, once before, like, there was kind of like this salad bar for some reason in this movie, but I guess I was wrong. So I guess eventually at that time, weirdly enough, is this building open 24 hours? Because here's the thing that kind of confused me is I don't really rationalize or understand the timing that kind of goes into this movie. because supposedly the Gremlins were to have eventually, when they were at this salad bar or this yogurt shop, they were to have eaten at midnight. But like when really looking at it, I'm like, so did these people just not sleep for 2 days, or like, I so so eventually Billy is to go home, and after this whole date where eventually he's to supposedly eat this chocolate mousse like thing where it's literally a chocolate mousse, and so Billy is going on and doing this date with Marla where eventually she kisses him at the end, and we have them kind of talk about their aspirations and stuff like that. We have Billy who's kind of slurping out of this wooden like cup, which I'm like, hey man, that actually looks really cool. Like we have like a tree trunk kind of thing that's like a cup that seems so interesting. I don't know why. It just seemed like with the whole theme going on, like I thought that was kind of cool. Um, but yeah, so uh, eventually Billy's to go home to seemingly have Kate just be like in a mess. And so Billy is like, well, hey, like, how's Gizmo going? And she's like, hey. So Billy goes into the place and is to see that Daffy is there instead of Gizmo. So he's like, this isn't Gizmo. Like, I don't know, like, where you got this from, but this isn't Gizmo. It's freaking Daffy. Like, get it right. Get it right, Billy. Come on, man. You read the script. So, Daffy is getting really out of control. And so, eventually, they have to, like, figure out a way to just kind of deal with Daffy. And they basically just chuck him into this little satchel. Because all of a sudden, we eventually have the Futtermans that end up arriving. We have Murray and Shelley or Sheila Futterman. Just kind of a. I wish they had more people that had the last name Futterman because that sounds hilarious. That sounds fun. So the Futtermans are to arrive to eventually just say that I guess Murray had some kind of engagement that he was the reason why he was kind of getting here. I guess some military get together or something like that. I don't remember exactly what it was exactly. And so eventually Billy is to tell Murray, it's like, well, hey, like, we would love to have you guys just like rest here and whatever, but come to find out, it seems like our building is getting fumigated, or like Kate and Billy kind of see something at the same time. And so they're like, well, yeah, like we have bugs or something like that. So eventually the Futtermans are eventually to go and to get a hotel. And you would have thought that Billy would have made possibly the nice gesture of like, well, hey, like we're going to pay for like your hotel room. Like, don't worry, because we're going to help you guys out, because I'm sorry about this whole circumstance. But Billy didn't say that. Billy should have been nice about it. Billy has money, right? No? Yes? Probably not. Anyways, because he hasn't put a ring on Kate, you know what I'm saying? Should have put a ring on that woman. Anyways, so Billy is to go and take Daffy back to the office to eventually realize that this has kind of gotten out of hand. That eventually, when he is to go back to his place, eventually he's starting to slowly but surely realize that eventually certain gremlins are starting to wreak havoc. That eventually they are eating past midnight, and so now Billy's like, "Oh my god!" So Billy is to eventually go and try to explain to Forrester this whole situation about what is cracking down. And so that eventually these gremlins are going to go inside this cocoon and eventually kind of eventually crack open to eventually be these more massive looking gremlins from the first film. Like, I don't know, like maybe somebody could probably just say it's like, oh no, they're roughly the same size. It's just the camera angle just makes them look smaller or whatever. But I don't know, like they just look way bigger in this film than they do in the first one for whatever reason. Maybe because it's the new batch. Maybe if they were to have done another one, maybe the Gremlins would even be bigger than than in the second one. I don't know. That seems to be the way about going about things. Where like look at Critters, where eventually Critters were like these small things about the size of your fist, but then eventually you end up getting like the new Binge, where the Critters end up being like the size of someone's head. So eventually we get eventually oh man, I completely forgot about the whole Grandpa Fred spot. Ugh. So let's backtrack a little because there's so much going on already in the thought process of this. Billy was to eventually go and speak to Grandpa Fred and to kind of talk about some ideas of what they're wanting to put together for the show. And Grandpa Fred is just like, man, like I just don't like I just don't have much upon this show. Like I just thought that there would be a lot more things going on here than what is actually to be presented. Because eventually, Fred is to eventually yell cut because there's to have been supposedly something that Fred was to use in the scene, but it wasn't there. So he's just like, man, like every time I turn around, like there's to not be like the best approach to this show possible, and so Fred is just wanting something more from this show. So or just he just wants to do something more, and eventually he comes up with that idea of how to eventually find this. So because Grandpa Fred is to eventually say all that he has like with him is to just be this this kind of sock puppet-ish like thing called Igor, that even when he is to kind of go and play with the thing, the teeth end up kind of breaking, and so Grandpa Fred is like so I don't know if they were actually supposed to do that or not. I don't know if they were even really going to use this thing for anything. But so eventually Billy is to kind of come up with kind of bat ideas, like kind of weird, goofy looking bat things that they could probably use for the show. And Fred is still just like, whatever. Like just, so eventually Billy and Fred are kind of wandering throughout the building at some point, and so it just kind of looks so interesting. Where eventually Grandpa Fred is to mention that Daniel only likes uh, like the kind of the colored uh, movies, the technicolored and up kind of films, and so Fred is to mention how really just the black and white films are the ones that are actually much more interesting and much more scary and whatever. And so eventually we have it where also Fred is just kind of complaining about like no one would probably be best having any interest in horror movies during 10 in the morning, and it's like no one really is gonna probably care about the Wolfman at 10 in the morning. So uh so I got that out of the way at least. So pushing on. So where were we in the midst of, because I had to kind of pull back to eventually go back to the forward part of it. Oh, Billy goes and takes Daffy and brings him back to the place, and so eventually the Gremlins are to go and eat after midnight. So the Gremlins are coming out of their cocoon, and so Billy is going to tell Forrester about what is going on. So let me reset here for a second. So, whew, so much information, so little time. So Billy is to eventually go to Forrester. Forrester is to go in a spot with his technicians to just kind of eventually ask Billy all this information that a lot of fans with the first film would always have these questions. And like they're basically working through these things right now where it's like, what about time zones? What if like a gremlin just has a little kernel of corn or something in his teeth by like 11:58 and like it just falls in his mouth right at midnight. Does that count as eating after like if it's just a kernel or something in its mouth, like does that count? So like Billy used to have to like answer all these questions. And so all of a sudden we end up having this gremlin that ends up coming flying through one of the TV monitors and ends up trying to attack one of the technicians. And so Billy is to come up with a master plan because evidently we have these really almost power of the sun like flashlights that end up going and hitting this one gremlin, which I think might be. It looks like George, but I don't think it's actually George. Um, I could just probably say it's TV Gremlin because all of them eventually at some point look the same, sadly. So now let's get to the interesting moment where we start to see all these gremlins all grown up, so to speak, without the exception of Gizmo because he's who he is. So Kate is to go off and eventually go and do a tour with all these people to eventually go and showcase this show called uh, Microwave Marge. So we have this cooking show of Microwave Marge, and so like, hey, and Kate is telling all these people like, hey, if you be really really quiet, you can go ahead and watch this show. So all of a sudden, Microwave Marge is going and doing her cooking to all of a sudden seemingly have Lenny pop from out of this pot, and so eventually Marge is to eventually kind of like push back to like whoa, and then all of a sudden this cover opens and it ends up being George. Where is Mohawk in all this? Not quite sure. But I think we kind of have to focus on George and Lenny right here, kind of creating this chaos. Maybe Mohawk is in the mix. I don't know. I think we kind of quickly forget about this character when eventually he's all grown up. So eventually Marge is to eventually try and like defend herself against these things, but eventually she just rushes out of there. So eventually Kate is to go and get her flashlight to go and like wave this flashlight around these gremlins who are trying to eventually put all these pots and pans into this microwave, which is kind of giving me a memory of the first Gremlins film where eventually there was a gremlin that went into one of the microwaves and got cooked. So eventually these gremlins are to eventually rush off to get the heck out of there because they're gonna get freaking toasted by this light. So eventually what ends up happening is that that eventually Daniel is to seemingly get attacked by one of the gremlins. It seems that uh, one of the gremlins was to go and attack Daniel's secretary, which is to be Betty, and then eventually goes and takes and puts on her like her little coat, and then is to just kind of play like she's secretary. Daniel ends up spotting this gremlin, and all of a sudden is to, of course, get attacked by it, and kind of have to really wrangle and muscle this gremlin off of him while he's eventually getting bitten in the hand. So it seems that Daniel is to eventually get some things shredded, and so it seems that Daniel figures out the perfect way to take down this gremlin by shredding it. So eventually, Billy and Forrester are to go to Daniel and to kind of like give him a kind of a report about what's going on. And so Daniel has gotten some gremlin business of himself, and so he's just like, oh, well, like, hey, those kind of things, like that's kind of what we're dealing with throughout this building. And so immediately Daniel has put Forrester on the task to try to take these things out, to wipe these things out. And so Forrester is just like, well, I guess I'm going to have to go with the expert, who's Billy, who has seen these things in action before. So Daniel's like, yeah, sure, sure. Like, go ahead and take these things out. And so eventually we get to a point here where a lot of things are just kind of eventually popping off. Eventually, Billy is to eventually go back to Daniel and have Daniel use this uh, like secret way of him getting from this building to eventually the outside to go and put up all these blinders on this building. So eventually, the Gremlins think that it's nighttime, when really it's just them trying to persuade these Gremlins to go outside during the day. Which eventually, when they try to do this, all of a sudden weather gets horribly bad to where it just forces them to just go with some other plan. So, uh, but that also is to have us deal with the slice of life thing that we're going to get to here, or slice o life. So let's get to that. So eventually we find out that seemingly gremlins are starting to mix it up within this slice of life place, where all of a sudden they are starting to see all these interesting gene slicing things that they can start to do. So eventually, we first off in this slice of life, we end up having one gremlin who is to grab this vegetarian concoction thing. Where all of a sudden we have this nurse gremlin that all of a sudden bubbles up into this kind of vegetarian looking gremlin. And so all of a sudden, all the gremlins are starting to get into these potions of sorts. Christopher Lee's to come in there and be like, hey, uh, like trying to eventually be like, I hope that this gremlin doesn't do this thing. I hope this gremlin doesn't go and drink this concoction. I hope that they don't do this. And that's all that they could really do. So we end up having one gremlin who eventually is to drink this concoction that is to supposedly be the brain concoction. And so all of a sudden, this gremlin is to just be massively intelligent and is to just be like rattling off all these like weird, goofy things that he used to say, where it's just like, okay, this guy is to like seem intelligent, but anything that's to kind of come out of his mouth is to, yeah, we are the creatures, and and so like hey, we are the creatures, and we're gonna be going on and just and we just want equality. We want a civilization just like you and all the other people that are to live amongst you. And I'm just like, what? Like, what is this character even actually saying? But so then eventually, this brain gremlin is to eventually go and give this other potion, this bat potion, to one of the gremlins, and all of a sudden we have now Bat Gremlin, and not only that, but then the Brain Goblin goes and finds this sunblock concoction that is to just be like, well, we have to do something with a gremlin outside the building because a Bat Gremlin, what good can he do inside this building? So we have to have him go outside the building. So eventually the Bat Goblin eventually goes and crashes his way through this building to all of a sudden have the Batman symbol, which I'm like, yeah, we're going to really go through some properties here. We're going to really just have some fun with this. So the Bat Goblin ends up going out of the building to eventually go and coincidentally meet the Futtermans, who are going and like eventually just going and checking things out, going on tours and whatever, or just kind of seeing the sights. And so this bat goblin attacks Murray, and so Murray is now like grabbing this thing's legs and trying to hassle with this thing. He's like, "Hey, like I've dealt with you things before." And so eventually Murray, who ends up getting scratched in the head, he ends up figuring out to go and take this uh, bat gremlin and go and shove it into this cement mixer and pours more cement on this thing. And so all of a sudden, this gremlin ends up getting out of the cement to eventually go and like flap his wings to eventually all of a sudden be stuck onto this one building like a normal gargoyle would. So, like, and then all of a sudden the cement just kind of gathers upon this whole entire gremlin. So, what is it going to be like? The Terror Dogs from Ghostbusters? That eventually the gremlin is going to crack uh, through this thing one day and eventually go after people. That might be the third film. I don't know. Anyways, so eventually Futterman is realizing what's going on, that the gremlins are going off again and doing this again. So eventually he heads to the building where Billy works to eventually find out that people are talking about gremlins again. So he's like, oh man, like I'm the guy for the job. I'm going to take this thing down. So Murray ends up deciding to see where Daniel is to get outside of this secret little thing that he is to use, and so Murray goes in and hits a button so he can get back into the building. So now we just have like a random batch of gremlin things go on, and so like all of this eventually like we have Kate eventually going through this elevator, and she is to eventually say a certain floor that is all of a sudden to be seemingly controlled by these gremlins. All of a sudden, all of these gremlin hands are to be like breaking through this elevator, grabbing onto Kate. She's getting pushed and shoved through all certain directions. There's all of a sudden to be random things that just come like going through this elevator and whatever till eventually Kate could finally figure out how to free herself from this elevator and get the heck out of there. So eventually we also have at some point where Billy is to also go and get knocked out seemingly by one gremlin and is to be taken to this one uh, dentist part of this movie where the gremlin is to basically ask Billy, "Is it safe?" and he's like going after him. To all of a sudden, we end up having Murray Futterman, who is to just kind of grab onto this dentist gremlin and try to help Billy. And so Murray ends up going and taking light from this dentist thing and kind of shining it uh, upon this dentist gremlin, pushing him or shoving him off to eventually run away from the light. So Billy is, of course, getting untied and so on and so forth. So eventually we have got any other things that we need to cover here? What is the one female gremlin, which I probably don't even have here? I'm sure I do. Um, Good God. Greta? Greta is to be the female gremlin, I guess, if there's to be one. Well, there's probably to be more than one, but still. Um, Eventually, we have Greta who latches on to Forrester and seemingly doesn't let go. She ends up just grabbing onto his leg, forcing him to just kind of run off. And eventually, towards the end of the film, Forrester is to eventually call Daniel. And so Daniel is to tell Forrester, like, "Hey, man, how about you take some time off?" Like, and so all of a sudden, Greta, if it's not weird enough that the Greta Gremlin, is to eventually be in this weird dance number of things, where all the Gremlins just really decide to just do this weird dance number, and eventually Murray is to look at all this like dance numberish like thing, and he's like, "Hey, these Gremlins aren't that bad." It's like, okay, sure, like I guess for this one, it's a little bit more Looney Tune-ish than in the first film, but still. So just the like amount of like things that they end up putting in this film. So uh eventually Greta at the end of this is to seemingly be in wedding garb, is to be the bride of a wedding. And then I guess Forrester is like, well, I guess I could do worse. So it's like, as he's like, his whole face is just covered in like lipstick, basically. So now that I kind of got that covered, so Frank Forrester. Uh, so we eventually have we also have an electric gremlin where eventually when Billy is to go and talk to Daniel, all of a sudden Billy is to grab this phone, have the electric gremlin go into the phone, and Billy is to put the electric gremlin on hold. So there's so much to talk about here. So where did I want to head to next? Okay, so Grandpa Fred is to eventually decide that he wants to go with the guy who is to basically be a cameraman and or anything to do with a camera he can do. So Grandpa Fred is at first going to interview seemingly the brain gremlin and just to kind of like ask him like what he really wants from this whole situation besides creating chaos. And so the brain gremlin is just to mention to kind of live in civilization as much as like these humans are, but then eventually like Grandpa Fred is like, well, yeah, but you're like also trying to like wipe us out. So what do you say about that? And so eventually the brain gremlin is to eventually go and just be like, well, like, hey, like if anything, like there's certain kind of like things that are to eventually come out of this, and so all of a sudden the brain gremlin is to have this gun and is to shoot this other gremlin called the beanie gremlin. And eventually like Grandpa Fred is just like, okay, I am not like, I'm just gonna go off and just just walk out of here because I'm not gonna do this interview and try to get shot. Um, so eventually, the cameraman and Grandpa Fred are to eventually be in these trash cans trying to do this interview as best they can, kind of doing this footage as best as they can do here. So eventually we get to a point where Kate is to eventually meet up with Marla. Marla is to eventually be put into this massive web of stuff because we eventually have one gremlin who decides to drink this spider concoction and become Spider Gremlin. So eventually Kate is trying to free Marla, and eventually Billy is to meet up with Marla and Kate, and so this is eventually we start to have montages where eventually Gizmo is to eventually get his confidence to try and go after these gremlins, but like he ends up doing like one whole thing really, in all honesty. So because supposedly Gizmo is to Rambo up, but doesn't do much in all honesty because like we have this one spot where eventually Gizmo is to be kind of shoved in this copier uh, by the one I think Gizmo Buster or something like that, and so like Gizmo is like bright light, so and then Gizmo is to eventually I think be run over by this train, this little toy train, and so Gizmo is just like, God, like these things are really just taking control over me and beating me down. So, because they're just having fun with them. And so eventually, Gizmo is to remember the words of Rambo, and he's like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to go and I'm going to get these certain kind of weaponry to eventually get my bow and arrow going, and I can go and try to attack. So, eventually Gizmo is to take down the spider gremlin and eventually kind of do this kind of lit pencil slash glue concoction, whatever that they use here, to eventually have this arrow go into this spider gremlin and to kill it off, to just kind of have it burst into flame and to kill it. So Billy goes and grabs Gizmo, and so now their master plan to wipe out the rest of the gremlins, because I'm not going to take any more time to go and talk about this movie. I just want to eventually just wrap this up because it's like, oof, like there is so much to go into. I didn't even go into the one. Let's go into it. So there's this one point where Fred is talking to Billy, and all of a sudden the movie just cuts and kind of fizzles out. And I'm like, okay, what's going on here? And all of a sudden we end up seeing the gremlins in the shadow that ended up coming onto the scene, and they're doing these like weird puppeteerish kind of things. And so all of a sudden, this is supposedly going off in this movie theater, where all of a sudden we have these customers that come out of this movie theater and are like, what the heck? Like, hey man, like this movie is worse than the first one. Like, come on, like give us our money back. And so we end up having all of a sudden where this theater manager is to go into the movie theater and eventually randomly find Hulk Hogan, and then Hulk Hogan is doing this promo to be like, hey man, get the hey brother, get the give these people what they want. Give them the film back. And then so like we of course have Hulk Hogan who rips his shirt because he's doing this promo for this movie. And I'm just like, God, this feels so random, but it's so cool. But it's random. Um, but it's just so goofy. And so if I didn't mention also, they had the whole like movie reviewer guy that was going to go and grab, like the Gremlins go and grab this movie theater guy or movie reviewer guy and kind of like choke him and whatever because they hate the fact that he's like critiquing the first movie and it seems like he didn't enjoy it and so on and so forth. So eventually, did I cover all the big juicy points? I feel like I did. So let's go into the wiping out moment of the Gremlins. So the plan is to eventually get the Gremlins at their weakest point. So Billy is to eventually tell Murray to go and soak all the Gremlins that are in this one lobby, because eventually they are to have sang this song, start spreading the news, I'm leaving today, New York, New York, which I'm like, okay, so when it is to hit nighttime, they're like thinking like, heck yeah, we're all going to leave here and we're going to eventually like spread and we're eventually going to take out the whole world. And they're thinking about this whole thing as like this huge global scale of a thing that they need to like eventually kind of condense this down in this one into this one building. So eventually Billy's to tell Murray to go and spray all these characters with this hose. And Murray's like, are you sure about that? And Billy's like, yeah, because I have a plan. So eventually what they end up concocting here is to eventually have the electrical gremlin go and come in while all these gremlins are to be wet and just kind of go and roundabout way just go through this entire gremlin lobby and go and wipe them all out, which of course he ends up doing. So kind of killing two birds with one stone, going and wiping out the electrical gremlin, but wiping out all the gremlins in total with the exception of Gizmo. So now all the gremlins are to be done and over and killed, and so all of a sudden we have the last last ditch moment where all of a sudden Daniel Clamp is to come rushing in with all these like SWAT members, and all of a sudden Daniel Clamp ends up slipping and falling, and I'm like, oh my god, like hopefully he didn't hurt himself. Freaking like kind of with all this goop and all this stuff that's there. So all of a sudden we eventually have like Billy kind of telling like Daniel, it's like, well, hey man, like it's great that you're here, but a little bit too late because we cover everything. Like we got rid of them, and so Daniel is like, oh well, that's great. Like so, eventually, uh, I think Daniel at some point is to eventually find uh, some art drawing thing that eventually Billy is to have about his hometown. And so Daniel is to come up with some kind of way of coming up with a uh, like a money making scheme out of that. And so like Billy and Kate are just like, well, it's our hometown. It's an exact replica of our hometown. And Daniel's like, no, like we're gonna come up with something. Like we're gonna figure things out. We're gonna come up with how we can make money off of this. Yeah, like really, like what do we need all these big, huge, massive buildings for? What if we just build like a really small town and just do that and just like okay, maybe that's what they were probably working towards when they were gonna possibly ever do a third film, but they never did. So so eventually Daniel is to also like see Gizmo, and Daniel is also just like, well, like you know what, you could probably go and do like merchandising for this little Gizmo. Like you can go and eventually like do all kinds of things with this character, merchandising and all like every like you would probably think that like Daniel would find anybody in the world and be like, we need to merchandise that person. We need to come up with a way to just churn and burn out money for some way or somehow. Like we need to come up with something. And I'm like, and I just find this character to be hilarious. How it's just like a guy that is to figure out a way to like mastermind and come up with like a way to just make money off of everything. And so and we also have at one point where eventually, I think either Forrest or Daniel is to eventually go and tell Christopher Lee's character before he ends up getting electrified and killed. Like, hey man, yeah, like that whole slice of life thing, yeah, your rent is gonna be like done. Like, after your release is up, you're donezo. Like, you guys are never coming back. Like you guys are the ones that kind of created this whole situation, so you're freaking done. I'm like, yeah, I wouldn't have trusted that thing anyways. And I think supposedly there was some other alternative thing that they were actually going to put there, like some kind of therapist place or something like that that they said somewhere in this movie. But anyways, with that said, this one was a real, and I don't think I covered everything, but I think I did good enough. I'm exhausted, and I still have like one to two other things to do. Oh, but like yeah, because I did so much yesterday, and now I'm just like man, it's starting to pile up. Or it's like man, I should just take a break one day, um, to eventually just kind of just like hey man, I went through all this, I did all this stuff. So now I think it's about time to freaking take a break one day. Um, but yeah, hopefully that'll be sometime soon. I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.